The morning Edwin Kendrick rode onto Myrtle Abbott's land, she was already holding a rifle, not because she had seen him coming, though she had, not because she was frightened, though a wiser woman might have been. She was holding the rifle because she had been repairing the fence post at the eastern edge of her property when she heard the distant drum of hoofbeats. And a woman alone on 160 acres in the Colorado Territory in the spring of 1882 did not set down a weapon when a strange man approached. She straightened her back, pushed the brim of her hat up with one finger, and watched Edwin Kendrick bring his black horse to a slow, deliberate stop exactly 10 feet from where she stood. He was handsome. She hated that she noticed it immediately, because she had been told he was coming, told what he wanted, told what kind of man he was, and none of those descriptions had included the word handsome. They had included words like cunning and relentless and dangerous. They had included the phrase, "he always gets what he goes after," offered by old Hiram Greeley at the general store, with a tone that mixed warning and admiration in equal and nauseating parts. Edwin Kendrick sat his horse with the particular ease of a man who had grown up on horseback and never once had reason to be afraid of anything he might encounter from that vantage point. He was perhaps 32, dark-haired, clean-shaven in a way that suggested recent effort, and he wore a jacket that cost more than anything Myrtle owned. His eyes were a shade of gray she would later struggle to name, something between the color of a storm cloud and the color of good steel, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not read, which she found more unsettling than anything else about him. "Miss Abbott," he said, and his voice was low and even, carrying that particular quality that told her he was accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. "Mr. Kendrick," she replied. A silence fell between them that lasted long enough to be deliberate on both sides. "I've come to make you a fair offer," he said. "I know what you've come for," she said, "and I know what you think is fair. Those two things are going to present a problem." He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that acknowledged a worthy opponent rather than a nuisance, and something shifted in the air between them that was not entirely about the land, though neither of them would have admitted that. Not yet. Not standing in the Colorado dust with a rifle between them and a betrayal neither of them had yet spoken aloud, and secrets that would take months to fully surface, and a forced choice that would determine whether everything either of them had sacrificed meant anything at all. What happened next would rewrite both of their lives. But to understand how they got to that fence line, to understand why her hands were steady on that rifle even though her heart was not, and why Edwin Kendrick had ridden 40 miles in the early morning cold to make an offer he already suspected she would refuse, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to before the dark past came calling. Back to when Myrtle Abbott was just a woman with a deed and a dream, and Edwin Kendrick was just the man who wanted to take both from her. It had started 6 months earlier, in the autumn of 1881, when Myrtle Abbott arrived in the town of Clearwater, Colorado, on the afternoon stage from Denver with 3 trunks, a cast iron skillet, $47 in coin, and a legal deed to 160 acres of land she had never seen. The land had come to her through her father, Thomas Abbott, who had filed a homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862 and spent the last 4 years of his life coaxing a small house and a modest crop out of the Colorado soil before a winter fever took him in January of 1881. He had left the land to Myrtle, his only surviving child, with a letter that was equal parts apology and instruction. He apologized for the state of the house, which he described as humble. He apologized for the outstanding debt at the Clearwater General Store, which he described as manageable. He gave her detailed instructions about the location of the water source, the temperament of the one remaining mule, and the neighbors to trust and those to be cautious of. He wrote one name in the cautious column in letters larger than the rest, underlined twice: Kendrick. He did not explain why. That was the maddening thing, and Myrtle had read that letter so many times in the weeks before she left Cincinnati that the paper had gone soft at the folds. Just the one name, underlined with no further elaboration, as though the name itself was sufficient warning. She had asked around in the weeks before she left, had written letters to the county office, to the land office in Denver, and had eventually pieced together something approaching an explanation. Edwin Kendrick owned the Kendrick Ranch, which bordered her father's claim on 3 sides. He had built it over the past 8 years into one of the most substantial cattle operations in that part of the Colorado Territory, expanding steadily, buying out smaller claims when their owners gave up or died or simply could not manage the brutal economics of frontier farming. He had made her father an offer twice, according to the county recorder's notes, and Thomas Abbott had declined twice. The third offer, apparently, was now being made to the daughter, and the county recorder, a cheerful man named Holt who wrote with enormous loops on his capital letters, had added a small personal note at the bottom of his reply to Myrtle's inquiry that read simply, "Kendrick usually gets what he wants. Don't sell before you see the land." Myrtle had taken that advice to heart. She had also taken a train west, then a stage-coach north, and had arrived in Clearwater with the particular determination of a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has decided to use that as fuel rather than complaint. Clearwater itself was not much to look at. It sat in a broad valley between 2 ridges of red and tan stone, with the mountains visible to the west and the plains stretching east, and it had the unfinished quality of a town that was still deciding whether to stay or blow away. There was a main street with a general store, a hotel that called itself the Clearwater Grand though it had 12 rooms and no indoor plumbing, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a post office that operated out of the general store 3 days a week, a church that was used on Sunday and as a meeting hall the rest of the time, and a saloon called the Red Lantern that Myrtle took careful note of and then decided to ignore. The person who greeted her most warmly on that first afternoon was a woman named Clara Jessup, who ran the laundry in a building beside the blacksmith, and who had apparently been a friend of Thomas Abbott's in the latter years of his life, visiting the claim to bring him baked goods and to make sure he was eating. Clara was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with clever dark eyes and a directness of manner that Myrtle found immediately refreshing. "Your father was a good man," Clara said, pressing both of Myrtle's hands between hers in the street outside the hotel. "Stubborn as that mule of his, but a good man. He talked about you constantly. Said you were the sharpest mind he'd ever encountered, and the reason he never won at cards in Cincinnati, because you always knew what hand he was holding." Myrtle felt the grief press up through her chest at that, sharp and sudden. She had not let herself feel it fully yet, had been too occupied with logistics and legal documents and the practical business of uprooting her life. She pressed it back down. "What do I need to know?" she asked, and Clara Jessup looked at her with an expression of approval. "About the land or about Kendrick?" "Start with Kendrick," Myrtle said. "My father thought him dangerous enough to underline his name." Clara's expression changed, becoming something more careful and considered. "Dangerous is a strong word. I'd say relentless. Edwin Kendrick wants your property because it sits between his eastern grazing fields and the river access. Right now his cattle have to travel around your claim to reach the water in summer. If he owned your land, he'd have a straight path from his eastern fields to the river, and that's worth a great deal to him. He's not the type to do anything illegal about it. He doesn't need to. He just keeps showing up with better numbers until people say yes." "What did he offer my father?" Clara named a figure. Myrtle had done enough research to know it was below market value, though not insultingly so. "And my father said no," Myrtle said. "Twice. Your father didn't want to sell. He'd put too much of himself into that land. And I think he hoped someone would come along who'd do the same." Clara gave her a significant look. "I think he hoped you'd come." That night, sleeping in the Clearwater Grand Hotel with its thin mattress and its drafty window, Myrtle lay awake and thought about what her father had left her and what she intended to do with it. She had a teaching certificate from the Cincinnati Normal School. She had a small amount of savings. She had skills she had been building quietly for years, reading everything she could find about farming, about water management, about the specific conditions of the Colorado Territory. She had made lists. She had written to agricultural extension offices. She had studied the Homestead Act until she understood it better than most lawyers. She was 26 years old, and she had never owned anything in her life that she had not earned through effort or sacrifice. The land her father had left her was the first thing that had simply been given, and that made her more determined than ever to prove it worthy. She was going to work the claim. She was going to meet Edwin Kendrick's offer with refusal, and she was not going to be moved. She met him for the first time not on the land but in the general store 2 days after her arrival, when she went to settle her father's outstanding account and to purchase supplies. She was at the counter talking with the storekeeper, a patient man named Dobbins, when she became aware of someone standing behind her with the particular stillness of a person who is waiting and not minding the wait because they are accustomed to things eventually coming to them. She turned around, and there he was. Edwin Kendrick in person, which was different from Edwin Kendrick as described, though she wasn't sure yet how. He was tall, with that dark hair and those gray eyes and the expensive jacket, and he looked at her with an expression that was not rude exactly but was very direct, as if he was already calculating something. "Miss Abbott," he said, "I was hoping to introduce myself." "You already know who I am," she said. Something that might have been amusement moved across his face. "Edwin Kendrick," he said, as if she had asked. "I know who you are too," she said. Another brief silence of the kind that seems to contain more information than words. Then he said, "I'd like to call on you at the property when you're settled. I have a proposition I believe you'll find worthwhile." "You can call," she said, turning back to the counter, "but bring your patience. I'll hear what you have to say and then we'll see." She heard him leave without further comment, and when she turned around again he was gone, and Dobbins was looking at her with an expression of impressed alarm. "Nobody talks to Edwin Kendrick like that," Dobbins said. "Nobody talked to me like that until I started talking back," Myrtle said pleasantly, and picked up her list again. The claim itself was both better and worse than she had expected, and her father's letter had been accurate on all counts. The house was indeed humble, which was a generous word for a structure that had a sound roof, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and walls that needed chinking before winter. The mule, whose name was apparently General Grant, was indeed temperamental but proved responsive to firm handling and a consistent schedule. The water source was exactly where her father had described, a clear spring at the north edge of the property that ran even in dry months. And this, she understood immediately to be the most valuable thing on the land, more valuable than the house or the grazing or the soil. The river her father had described in his letter ran along the western boundary of the Kendrick Ranch, and her property sat between the ranch's eastern fields and that river, just as Clara had said. From the high ground of her property she could look west and see the vast spread of the Kendrick operation, the distant line of fence posts, the dark moving shapes of cattle on the hillside. It was large. It was clearly prosperous, and she understood, standing on that high ground with the autumn wind pulling at her coat, exactly why the man wanted her land. She spent her first weeks doing what needed to be done before winter arrived. She hired 2 men from town on a temporary basis to help rechink the walls and repair the fence line, and she paid them in cash at fair wages, which earned her a reputation in Clearwater as a square dealer. She established a routine with General Grant, who eventually stopped trying to bite her on the 3rd day and proceeded to become, if not affectionate, at least cooperative. She introduced herself to the other neighboring claim holders, a couple named the Garfields to the north who had been on their land for 3 years and were barely holding on, and an older man named Silas Pryor to the south who raised chickens and grew a spectacular vegetable garden, and who brought her a jar of preserved tomatoes within a week of her arrival as a welcoming gesture. Silas Pryor became, in those first months, something close to a mentor. He had been farming in the Colorado Territory since 1875 and knew its seasons and moods with an intimacy born of long acquaintance. He sat with her at her kitchen table on cold evenings and talked about what grew well and what failed, about the particular behavior of the spring runoff, about how to read the clouds for weather and the soil for moisture. He was 70 years old and sharp as a new knife, and he had strong opinions about Edwin Kendrick. Not a bad man, Silas said one evening, in a tone that suggested this was a complicated assessment. Not a good one, neither. The kind of man who decides what he wants and then adjusts his understanding of right and wrong to suit getting it. Your father understood that about him. That's why he never sold. Was there bad blood between them? Myrtle asked. Silas was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. Kendrick made the second offer right after your father's bad year, when the crop failed and the mule got sick and your father was in debt. Made him the offer knowing he was desperate and knowing the price was low. Your father saw it for what it was, a man waiting for weakness to exploit. He got himself out of the debt another way, borrowed from the church fund until harvest, and he never forgot that Kendrick had tried to use his trouble against him. Myrtle filed this away in the part of her mind where she kept important facts, the part she thought of as her working ledger, where she recorded things that mattered for decisions. Edwin Kendrick came to the claim at the end of October, 3 weeks after Myrtle's arrival, riding the black horse she would later learn was named Alonso, and which was, like its owner, well-bred and difficult to read. He came alone, which surprised her, and he did not come with the swagger she had expected. He came with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a posture that was perfectly neutral and an expression that told her nothing. And she met him at the gate with the rifle slung over her shoulder rather than in her hands, because she had decided that holding it in her hands would be aggressive rather than cautious, and she had found in life that the calibration between the two mattered. He took off his hat when she came to the gate. That also surprised her. "Miss Abbott," he said, "thank you for agreeing to see me." "I said I'd hear the offer," she said. "Come inside." She had debated that last part, but the wind was cold and the negotiation would take longer if they were both freezing, and she had already set a pot of coffee on the stove because Silas Pryor had told her that hospitality in a negotiation was not weakness, it was strategy. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes taking in the small, tidy room, the repaired walls, the organized shelves, the evidence of a woman who had moved in and intended to stay, and she watched his expression process this information without giving away what conclusion he drew from it. She poured the coffee and sat across from him and said, "Tell me what you want to offer." He told her. It was more than what he'd offered her father, and she had expected that, because he had time to revise upward, and because offering her father's price to a woman who had already demonstrated that she knew his name and his purpose would have been an insult, and he was not, whatever else he was, stupid. She listened to the full offer without interrupting. He was thorough. He talked about the per-acre value, the condition of the improvements, the way the market was trending, and the specific advantage the property presented for water access. He was honest about that last part, which she respected despite herself, rather than trying to disguise his motivation. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. "No," she said. He blinked. Just once, a small motion, but she caught it because she was watching for it. "No, not yet," she clarified. "I've been on this property for 3 weeks. I'm not making a permanent decision in 3 weeks. I'm going to work the claim for a full year. At the end of that year, if I want to sell, we can talk again." "A year is a long time," he said, and there was something careful in his voice. "For what?" she asked. Another brief pause. "For a woman alone on the frontier." "I appreciate the concern," she said, in a tone that indicated she did not find it especially concerning. "A year, Mr. Kendrick. After that, we'll talk." He put his hat back on and stood up and said, "I'll come back in a year." "I know you will," she said. "You can show yourself out." He left. and Myrtle sat alone in her kitchen with the cold wind pressing against the rechinked walls, and she let herself feel the weight of what she had just committed to, a full year on the Colorado frontier, alone, in a small house that her father had built with his own hands and his own stubborn hope. The grief came back then, quiet and full, and she allowed it for a few minutes before she set it aside and began making her list for the next day. She had not expected to see Edwin Kendrick again before that year was out. She was wrong about that. He came back in November, not to press the offer but because, as he explained with a formality she found both annoying and oddly endearing, he had heard from Sela's prior that the fence on her southern boundary was damaged in a section she had not yet reached, and that the section in question bordered his own property, and that he was going to repair his side of the fence and thought he should let her know. She went out to watch, because watching men who wanted her land work on her fence felt important, and she found herself standing in the cold November morning observing Edwin Kendrick and two of his ranch hands fix a fence with the kind of efficient, practiced competence that told her he had not built his operation by sitting back and directing others. He worked alongside his men, and he worked well, and when it was done and his men had ridden back, he stood on his side of the fixed fence and she stood on hers, and they had a conversation about nothing in particular, the weather and the winter prospects, and whether the spring runoff would be heavy. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and at the end of it he tipped his hat and rode away, and Myrtle walked back to her house with the distinct and uncomfortable sensation that something had shifted very slightly in her assessment of the situation, and she did not enjoy that sensation, and she decided to ignore it. He came back in December, this time openly, to say that a section of her property's water channel, the channel that directed the spring into a usable flow for the house and the kitchen garden, was at risk of freezing and blockage in the coming cold snap, and that the solution was a particular type of insulation around the channel walls that he had developed on his own property, and that he would be happy to show her how to do because it would take about an hour and was not difficult. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question honestly rather than deflecting it. "Because if the channel freezes and breaks, the repairs in winter will cost you more than the insulation now. And I would rather negotiate with you in spring over a property that is in good condition than over a property that has been damaged." This was, she acknowledged to herself later, a completely logical and self-interested reason, and the fact that he offered it rather than some more altruistic explanation actually made her trust it more than she would have trusted a claim of pure generosity. She let him show her the insulation technique, and they worked side by side in the cold December afternoon, and she noticed that he explained things without condescension, treating her as a person who could learn rather than a person who needed rescue, and she noticed it and filed it away in the working ledger under a category she had not yet labeled. By the time February arrived, she had achieved something like a cold-weather equilibrium. The house was warm, the spring was flowing, General Grant was fed and sulky but healthy, and she had developed a routine that satisfied her practical need for structure and left her evenings free for reading and writing letters to the various agricultural and legal contacts she had been cultivating since before her arrival. She wrote to a man in Denver who was experimenting with drought-resistant varieties of wheat. She wrote to a woman in Kansas who had been farming alone for 6 years, and who wrote back with advice that was both practical and unexpectedly funny. She wrote to her father's old attorney in Cincinnati about the status of the deed and about whether there were any legal vulnerabilities in her claim that she should be aware of. The attorney's reply, which arrived in early March, was the first thing that genuinely frightened her. He wrote carefully, clearly choosing his words. He told her that he had received an inquiry from a Denver law firm representing an unnamed client about the provenance of the original homestead claim filed by Thomas Abbott. The inquiry had asked specifically about whether Thomas Abbott had met all requirements of the Homestead Act at the time of filing, including the requirement of continuous residence during the 5-year proving period. Myrtle read this paragraph 3 times. Her father had left the property twice during the proving period. Once in 1876, to come to Cincinnati when her mother was dying, a trip that had lasted 3 weeks. And once in 1878, when a dispute over survey lines had required him to travel to Denver and appear before the land office. She had not known about these absences, had not known they might be relevant, but she knew enough about the Homestead Act to understand that absences during the proving period could, in theory, be used to challenge the validity of a claim. She sat down at her kitchen table and did not panic, which required considerable effort, and then she thought it through methodically. The attorney said the inquiry was from an unnamed client. She did not need the name to be named. She already knew it. This was the dark past coming forward. This was Edwin Kendrick not waiting for the year to be out. She felt something that was not exactly betrayal, because he had never promised her anything, but that had the same shape and the same burn. The realization that the man she had begun, against her better judgment and in the privacy of her own mind, to think of as something other than an adversary was in fact exactly that adversary, working against her through the legal system while she stood in the cold afternoons learning insulation techniques from him. She spent a week being cold and furious and methodical. She wrote to the land office in Denver herself. She wrote to a second attorney who specialized in homestead law. She gathered every document she had related to her father's claim, spread them across her kitchen table, and went through them line by line, looking for both vulnerabilities and defenses. She found that her father had in fact filed an explanatory affidavit with the Denver land office in 1876, before the trip to Cincinnati, explaining the medical emergency and requesting that the absence be noted but not count against the continuous residence requirement. She did not find any similar documentation for the 1878 trip. This was the trap, and Edwin Kendrick had laid it while shaking her hand and fixing her fence. She thought about what to do with her anger for 3 days, and then she saddled General Grant, who expressed his displeasure through a prolonged complaint that she ignored, and she rode to the Kendrick Ranch. The Kendrick Ranch headquarters were an impressive sight, even to a woman in the specific state of cold fury that Myrtle was experiencing. The main house was large by frontier standards, timber-framed and solid, with a covered porch running along the front and 2 stone chimneys. Behind it were a series of barns and outbuildings in good repair, a bunkhouse for the hands, and the visible infrastructure of a working cattle operation managed with precision and competence. She acknowledged all of this clinically and without admiration. A young ranch hand came out of the barn when she rode into the yard, and she told him she was there to see Edwin Kendrick, and he went inside the main house and came back saying Mr. Kendrick would be right out. Edwin Kendrick came onto the porch with a neutral expression that changed, very slightly, when he saw her face. She had been told her face was expressive. She had spent 26 years trying to control it. At this moment she was allowing it to speak clearly. "Miss Abbott," he said. "You need to call off your lawyers," she said. The neutral expression held for exactly 1 second, and then something moved behind his gray eyes, a flash of something that was either guilt or surprise, and she found she could not tell which, and both mattered. "Come inside," he said. "I'm fine here." He came off the porch and stood in the yard with her, which she appreciated because it meant they were on equal ground rather than him looking down at her, and he said quietly, "What are you referring to?" "The inquiry to my father's attorney about the validity of his homestead claim," she said. "The unnamed client from the Denver law firm. I know who unnamed means, Mr. Kendrick." The silence that followed was different from their previous silences. This one had weight in it. "The inquiry was made on my behalf," he said, and she credited him for not pretending otherwise. "It was a legal option that I asked my attorney to investigate. While you were fixing my fence and insulating my water channel," she said. Another silence. "Yes. That," she said, "is what my father warned me about. The man who waits for weakness and uses it." She saw that land. She saw it in the slight change around his eyes, which was the only place Edwin Kendrick seemed to show anything. That reference to her father's assessment hit him somewhere that mattered. "If the claim has legal vulnerabilities," he said, and his voice was not entirely even, "I have a right to investigate them." "You have a legal right," she said, "and I have a moral assessment of how you're using it. Those two things can both be true at the same time." He did not answer immediately, and in the pause she pressed forward, because she had thought carefully about what to say and had not ridden 15 miles in the March cold to deliver half a message. "I am going to contact every attorney and every land office official who has any involvement with this inquiry," she said. "I am going to document my father's 1876 affidavit and find every possible documentation of his 1878 trip. I am going to defend this claim with everything I have, and if you pursue this, I am going to make sure that every person in Clearwater and every farmer in this valley knows exactly what kind of business practice you use when you want someone's land." It was a threat, and she knew it, and she made it clearly and without drama. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back at him, and then he said, "You would do that?" "Yes," she said. "It's not a bluff," he said, and it was not a question. "I have never bluffed in my life," she said. Something changed in his expression then. Something that was not capitulation but was more complicated, the look of a man who is reassessing his understanding of a situation more thoroughly than he had expected to need to. "I'll contact the attorney," he said. "I'll have the inquiry dropped." She had expected to have to fight longer for that. The speed of it surprised her, and she was careful not to show the surprise. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Abbott," he said as she turned General Grant to leave. She looked back at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the method, not for wanting the land that hasn't changed, but for the method." She looked at him for a moment. The March wind was pulling at his dark hair, and the sun was behind him, and she was furious, and something else she refused to name. "I know," she said, and rode away. He gave her 3 months after that. 3 months in which she did not see him, during which the spring arrived and transformed her property from frozen and austere to something that made her understand why her father had refused to sell. The green came up through the brown in early April, tender and insistent, and the spring ran clear and cold and perfect, and the first birds came back, and General Grant found a pocket of early grass and stood in it with an expression of pure satisfaction that Myrtle photographed in her memory, because it was the first genuinely peaceful moment she had experienced since arriving. She planted a kitchen garden following Sela's Pryor's advice. She wrote back to the man in Denver about the drought-resistant wheat and ordered a small quantity of seed to test on a corner of her field. She began keeping detailed records of the property's water output, soil conditions, and weather patterns, building the kind of data that she instinctively knew would be valuable and that no one else had thought to collect. She also, in the quiet evenings, thought about Edwin Kendrick more than she wanted to. She thought about the insulation technique and the fence repair and the moment he had said "I'm sorry" with that particular quality in his voice that had not been performance. She thought about the gray eyes and the way he talked about the land, not as an asset but with a specific knowledge that came from years of attention. She thought about what Clara Jessup had said, that he was not a bad man, complicated, which Myrtle had learned in 26 years of living was often the truest thing you could say about a person, complicated. She went to Clara's laundry one afternoon in May with mending that could have waited a week and stayed for 2 hours talking about nothing specific. And at the end of it she asked, with elaborate casualness, what Clara knew about Edwin Kendrick's history. Clara, who was not fooled for a moment, looked at her with warm, knowing eyes and told her. Edwin Kendrick had come to the Colorado Territory at the age of 22 with a small inheritance from his grandfather, a talent for cattle management learned in Texas, and a plan. He had built the ranch over 8 years through a combination of genuine hard work, sound decisions, and the kind of relentlessness that was either a virtue or a flaw depending on which side of it you were on. He had been engaged to a woman in Denver 7 years ago, a woman from a wealthy family, and the engagement had ended badly, and Edwin had come back to the ranch and buried himself in work and had not, to anyone's knowledge, been seriously interested in a woman since. Why did the engagement end? Myrtle asked. She said he cared more about the land than he did about her, Clara said. And from what I understand, she wasn't entirely wrong. But I also think he was 25 and didn't know yet that the land was a substitute rather than the thing itself. Myrtle sat with this for a long time on the ride home, jostling along on General Grant through the warm May afternoon, and she told herself firmly that it did not matter, that the complicated history of a man who was trying to take her property was not her concern, that she was here to work the land and build something of her own, and she did not have time or inclination for complications of the heart. She almost believed herself. Edwin Kendrick came back in June. He did not come with lawyers or offers or legal inquiries. He came to a community gathering at the Clearwater Church, a summer social that Clara organized every year, and Myrtle went because it was the kind of community event that a person who intended to stay made a point of attending. She wore the best dress she had brought from Cincinnati, a deep blue with a fitted waist, and she put her hair up properly. And she arrived to find the church hall decorated with wild flowers and ribbons, and approximately 40 people from the surrounding claims and the town itself. And Edwin Kendrick standing near the door talking with the Reverend about something with his hat in his hands, and his gray eyes alert to the room. He saw her when she came in, and she saw him see her, and she gave him a nod and went to find Clara, who was presiding over a table of food with the air of a general overseeing a well-planned campaign. She managed to avoid him for approximately an hour, which was roughly as long as avoidance was possible in a room containing 40 people. He found her eventually near the window with a glass of lemonade, looking at the mountains in the long June evening light, and he said, "Miss Abbott," and she said, "Mr. Kendrick," and they stood side by side and looked at the mountains. "Your property must be looking well this time of year," he said. "Beautifully," she said. "I noticed the test wheat plot in the eastern corner," he said, and she heard in his voice that he had been observing her property from the ridge, which she had expected and was not alarmed by. "Do you know the variety?" She asked because she was genuinely curious whether he had recognized it. "It's a drought-resistant hybrid I've seen experimental reports about," he said. "I didn't know anyone in this territory was actually trialing it." "I wrote to a man in Denver," she said. "He's been developing it for several years. The yield data is promising." He turned to look at her then, and the gray eyes had something in them that was not anything he could call strategic interest, because strategy would not have made his expression quite that open. "You've been doing serious research," he said. "Since before I arrived," she said. "I wasn't going to come out here without understanding what I was walking into." "I underestimated you," he said. The directness of it stopped her. She had not expected him to say it like that, plainly and without anything defending it. "Yes," she said, "you did." "I'd like to stop doing that," he said, "if you'll allow it." She looked at him and thought about all the items in her working ledger, the fence repair and the insulation technique and the lawyer inquiry and the apology and the way he had just named what he had done without excuse. She thought about Clara's assessment. She thought about her father's warning, underlined twice, and what it meant and what it didn't mean. "We can try," she said. The summer that followed was the most complicated and the most vivid of Myrtle Abbott's 26 years. And she tracked it afterward with the same precision she brought to everything, because she needed to understand how it had happened, how a rivalry had become something else, how she had gone from holding a rifle at her gate to looking forward to the twice-weekly conversations that had become, without either of them quite planning it, a feature of her life. He would ride by on his way to check the eastern pasture, which required passing her property's northern boundary, and if she was outside, which she generally was, he would stop, and they would talk about the wheat test, which was showing promising results by July, about the water levels in the river and what that meant for the summer grazing, about the Garfields to her north, who were struggling, and whether there was anything to be done to help them hold on through the season. About books, because she had discovered that Edwin Kendrick was, surprisingly, a reader, and not just of the practical variety but of actual literature. And he had opinions about Dickens that were both unconventional and interesting, and she disagreed with half of them energetically. She looked forward to the disagreements. She noticed that she looked forward to them. She filed this in the working ledger under the category she had by now labeled, honestly if reluctantly, personal. He came to help when General Grant escaped his paddock in August and made a 2-mile expedition into the surrounding countryside that required 4 hours and most of Myrtle's patience to resolve. Edwin showed up, having seen the open paddock gate from the ridge, and rode without comment to where Myrtle was following the mule's tracks through the brush. And between the two of them, they cornered General Grant in a shallow draw and persuaded him back to the property, with a degree of negotiation that Myrtle thought was more dignified than the mule deserved. Afterward they sat on the fence of the paddock in the evening light, drinking water and not talking, and the silence was of a kind that required no filling, and that told her something she could no longer pretend not to know. "Edwin," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt him go still beside her at the sound of it. "Myrtle," he said, which was the first time he had used hers, and the way he said it was entirely different from the way he had said Miss Abbott. She looked at the mountains and he looked at the mountains, and the evening settled around them like something closing, like a door or a hand, and neither of them said anything else for a while. "Are you going to try to buy my land again?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said, and the honesty of the uncertainty was itself an answer. She nodded slowly. "Then I suppose we'll see where we get to." What followed was a courtship that neither of them named, conducted in the open air of the Colorado Territory with no chaperones and no pretense, because pretense required energy that they were both using for other things. He brought her books from his library, sliding them through the window of the conversation in casual references. "Have you read this? I thought of it when you mentioned that." And she read them all and brought them back with her margins filled with notes. And he read her notes and they argued about the books, and the arguments were some of the best conversations she had ever had. He came to the harvest of the test wheat plot in September and helped cut it without being asked, and they worked side by side in the September heat, and she was aware the entire time of him beside her, the particular movement of his hands, the way he worked steadily without showing off. And she thought that a man who worked like that next to a woman without performing it for her was either completely self-contained or completely comfortable, and she had come to believe he was the latter, at least with her. In October, exactly 1 year after his first official offer, he came to the claim. Myrtle saw him coming from a long way off, because she was at the eastern fence repairing a post, and the October morning was clear and sharp, and the black horse and the dark-haired rider were visible against the pale gold of the autumn grass for a full 5 minutes before he arrived. She had time to think about what was coming and to compose herself and to make her decisions. She was standing with her rifle slung over her shoulder when he rode up, not because she needed it but because the first time he had come she had been holding it, and there was something intentional in repeating the image. "Edwin," she said. "Myrtle," he said. He brought his horse to a stop 10 feet away, and they looked at each other in the October morning with a year's worth of everything between them. "I've come to make you a fair offer," he said. She felt the words hit differently now than they had in the version she had been preparing for, because she had not expected him to use the same phrasing as that first day, and she saw in his gray eyes that the repetition was deliberate, a callback, a framing that acknowledged they both knew where they had started and that a great deal had happened since. "Tell me," she said. He told her. It was substantially more than the first offer, genuinely fair by any market standard she had studied, and she could hear in how he presented it that he had done his own research and had arrived at the number honestly rather than strategically. She listened to all of it without interrupting, as she had the first time. When he finished, she said, "I have a counteroffer." Something shifted in his expression. Something that contained both surprise and hope and caution, all at the same time, a complicated movement through his gray eyes. "I'm listening," he said. "I don't want to sell the land," she said. "I've spent a year working it and understanding it, and I believe it is worth more than what you're offering, not just in money but in what it could become. The wheat variety I'm testing is going to produce. My water records show the spring is producing more reliably than anything else in this valley. The soil in the northern section responds well to winter wheat. This is a genuinely productive claim, and selling it would be a mistake." She paused. He waited. "However," she said, "the water access issue is real. You do need a reliable path for your cattle to reach the river in summer. Driving them the long way around costs you in weight loss and time. I understand that." "Yes," he said. "So here is my counteroffer," she said. "I will grant you a permanent easement across the north portion of my property, a clearly defined corridor for your cattle to reach the river, in exchange for fair compensation, the value of which I have calculated." She named a figure. "That resolves your water access problem. I keep the land, you keep the agreement, and both of us get something worth having." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched him processing it, watched his gray eyes working through the implications, the legal, the financial, the practical. She had done the numbers carefully. She knew it worked for him. She knew it was a fair resolution to the problem he had actually been trying to solve, as opposed to the solution he had been reaching for out of habit, and the conviction that full ownership was the only satisfying answer to anything. "You've thought about this for a long time," he said. "I've thought about everything for a long time," she said. "That's how I think." He looked at her, and something happened in his expression that was entirely separate from the land negotiation, something that had to do with the way the October light was on her face, and the way she had just spoken, and the year of everything that had built between them. "You'd be giving me less than I came for," he said. "I'd be giving you exactly what you need," she said. "That's different." Another pause, and then something moved across his face that was not something she had seen there before, something that looked like relief, or like a man setting something down that he had been carrying a long time. "Yes," he said. "All right." "Yes to the counteroffer," she said. "Yes to everything," he said, and the way he said it was unmistakable. She felt her heart move in her chest like something waking up. "Edwin," she said carefully, "what does everything include?" He got down off the black horse, which she had not expected, and he came to the fence and stood on his side of it and looked at her on her side of it, and the fence between them felt like the last symbol of everything that had been negotiated between them, rival and adversary and tentative allies, and whatever this was now. "It includes," he said quietly, "the admission that I have spent the last 4 months failing to tell you that the land stopped being the primary reason I came by here. The eastern pasture is on the other side of my property from the river," she said. "I know, I have maps." He exhaled something that might have been a laugh. "You've known for a while." "Since July," she said, "and you didn't say anything." "I was waiting to see what you'd do with it," she said. "What I'm doing with it," he said, "is telling you that I would very much like to call on you properly, not as a neighbor with a business interest. As a man who has great respect and admiration, and if I'm honest, considerably more feeling than that, for the woman on the other side of this fence." Myrtle set the rifle down, leaning it against the post, and then she opened the fence gate and stepped through to his side, which she had not done before, and she stood in front of him in the October morning with the mountains behind him and the clear Colorado sky above them both. "I would like that," she said. He took her hand then, carefully, as if it were something he was not sure he was allowed to do, and he held it for a moment and looked at her, and the gray eyes were entirely without guard for the first time, and she saw in them something that answered the question she had been carrying in the unlabeled section of her working ledger since the night in August by the mule paddock. "Your father warned you about me," he said. "He did," she said. "Was he wrong?" She considered him, the whole of him, The year's worth of knowing, the fence and the insulation and the lawyers and the apology and the books and the arguments and this moment, all of it weighed together. "He was warning me about a version of you," she said. "I think you've become a different one." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was formal and careful and entirely sincere, and she felt it travel up her arm and into her chest where it settled alongside everything else she had been filing away. "I have work to do to deserve that assessment," he said. "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "You do." He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind she had not seen before, which transformed his face entirely and made her understand what she had been dealing with for a year, a man who had been keeping a great deal back. He rode home that afternoon with the easement still under negotiation in terms of the written agreement, and with less than he had arrived for in the most technical sense, and with something he had not owned when he rode in, which was the particular lightness of a man who has stopped lying to himself about what he wants. The formal courtship began. In Clearwater in 1882, a formal courtship meant specific things. It meant calling at the property with stated intentions. It meant conversations in visible places. It meant Clara Jessup knowing about it within a week, which she did, and responding with the energy of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this development and who intends to enjoy it thoroughly. Clara told her, privately and with great warmth, that she thought they were well matched, and that Edwin Kendrick had been, in her observation, a man with a considerable capacity for love that had been locked up behind his ambition for a very long time, and that it would take the right person to open it, and that she was fairly sure she was looking at the right person. Myrtle received this with the characteristic mix of practical reserve and private satisfaction that she had been developing since childhood, and thanked Clara, and went back to her property, and spent the evening working on the easement agreement by lantern light, and acknowledging to herself that she was very happy. The easement was signed in November, drafted by Edwin's attorney in Denver, and reviewed by Myrtle's attorney in Cincinnati, who wrote her a letter of delighted bewilderment at the outcome. The terms were fair, clearly defined, and legally sound, and on the day they signed it at the desk in Clearwater's land office, Edwin and Myrtle sat across from each other with the document between them, and when it was done and witnessed, Edwin looked at her across the desk with those gray eyes and said quietly, "Your father would have respected this." The grief came up again as it did periodically, and she let it be present for a moment before she said, "I think he would have been suspicious of you for at least another year." "He would have been right to be," Edwin said. "He would have come around eventually," she said. "He was fair." "I hope so," Edwin said, and she heard in it that her father's hypothetical approval mattered to him, which was a thing she had not expected to find moving and did. The winter was the best one she had spent. Not easiest, because the Colorado winter of 1882 to 1883 was significant and demanded constant management, keeping the water channel clear, managing the feed for General Grant, maintaining the house against the cold. But it was filled with a richness that had not been in the previous winter, because Edwin came through the cold afternoons with books and news and conversation, and they sat at her kitchen table and talked for hours, and she began to understand the full dimensions of him in ways that the border fence conversations had not revealed. He told her about his early years in Texas, the grandfather who had taught him to work cattle, the years of building the Colorado operation, the engagement that had ended badly. He told it without self-pity, but also without the protective editorializing she might have expected. He told it plainly and let her draw her own conclusions, and her conclusion was that he had been, at 25, a man who had known what he wanted materially and had not yet understood what he needed emotionally, and that the intervening years had given him the latter knowledge without giving him anyone to use it with until now. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's absences that had felt like abandonment until she was old enough to understand they were a different kind of love, a love expressed through the land rather than through presents. She told him about the teaching certificate and the years of building towards something, and not knowing what the something was, and how the inheritance had felt not like a windfall but like a direction. "You've always known how to make decisions," he said. "I've always been afraid to make the wrong ones," she said. "That's different. It looks the same from outside." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was a significant development. "The decision to stay here," he said. "The counteroffer. Were you afraid?" "Terrified," she said calmly. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers, and this had become a comfortable gesture between them, the easy physical warmth of people who had decided to trust each other. "You didn't show it," he said. "A woman alone negotiating with a man who has more resources than she does," she said, "cannot show everything she feels. You know that. You built your operation the same way." "Yes," he said, "but I didn't like it when you did it to me." She smiled. "That's how you know it was working." He proposed in February. Not dramatically, not with performance, which was exactly right for both of them. He proposed in the kitchen after supper on a cold February evening with the fire going and the snow falling outside and General Grant making his nightly opinions known from the paddock, which provided, she felt, an appropriately absurdist backdrop for one of the most significant moments of her life. He said, "Myrtle, I would like to marry you." She looked at him across the table and thought about everything she had thought about and everything she had decided and the working ledger that had been building entries about this man for a year and a half, and she said, "Yes." He exhaled. She saw the breath leave him, the release of something held, and she realized that he had not been certain, which moved her more than confidence would have. "I was afraid you'd say no," he said. "I considered it," she said honestly, "for about 3 seconds. What decided it?" "The fence," she said. He blinked. "The fence. The first fence you fixed on my property, your side of the fence. You did it because it bordered your land and you had a self-interested reason. But you fixed it well and you did it yourself, and you told me about it beforehand rather than just doing it. A man who fixes something well when he doesn't have to impress anyone and who is honest about his reasons is a man I trust." She paused. The rest of it confirmed what the fence started. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him taking this in with that thoroughness he brought to everything. "I'll fix every fence on your property," he said. "You absolutely will not," she said. "They're my fences, but I'll accept help when I need it." He laughed then, fully and openly, and it was a sound she had not heard enough of and intended to hear much more. They were married in the Clearwater Church in April of 1883, in the first warm week of spring, with Clara Jessup in the front row and Silas Pryor beside her, and a collection of neighbors and townspeople who had watched the year's events unfold with varying degrees of astonishment and approval. Myrtle wore a dress she had ordered from Denver, ivory with a fitted bodice and small pearl buttons, and she carried wildflowers from her own property, the first spring flowers that had come up through the warming ground. Edwin wore his best jacket, the expensive one she had noted on his first visit to the claim, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the short aisle with an expression on his face that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The Reverend performed the ceremony, and when it was done and Edwin had kissed her with a warmth and tenderness that drew a small sound of collective approval from the gathered witnesses, they walked out into the April sunshine, and Clara Jessup burst into tears of satisfaction, and Silas Pryor shook Edwin's hand, with the grip of a man saying something without words. They spent the first night at the Clearwater Grand Hotel, which was still 12 rooms and still without indoor plumbing, and which was therefore entirely appropriate in its continuity with how Myrtle had arrived in this town. And in the morning they rode back to the Abbott claim together, which was how Myrtle had decided to handle the question of whose property they would live on. "The house is smaller," Edwin had said during the discussion. "I know," she had said. "We'll build a better one." "We could live at the ranch house," he said. "Your ranch house is organized around your operation," she said. "The Abbott claim is my operation. I want to be on my land. But I want you to be there too." He had thought about this for a moment and then said, All right, we'll build. The building started in May and was finished by October of 1883, a proper two-story house in good Colorado timber with a stone foundation, and a covered porch on the east side that looked toward the mountains, and a large kitchen with a proper stove and real windows. Edwin worked on the building himself alongside the crew he hired, because he was the kind of man who did that. And Myrtle made the design decisions with the precision of someone who had spent a year in a two-room house, thinking about what she would do differently if she had the chance. The original house she kept standing. She converted it to a small barn and storage building, partly for practical reasons and partly because it had been her father's, and she was not ready to let it go entirely. They managed two properties from the Abbott claim, which required organization and clear systems, and Myrtle brought her native talent for both to the task. She oversaw the Abbott operation, the wheat trials which were showing genuinely good results by the 1883 harvest, the kitchen garden, the spring management. Edwin oversaw the ranch operation, but he was also on the Abbott land daily, and the boundaries between the two became comfortable rather than contested. The Garfields to the north, who had been struggling, had a hard winter in 1882 and another difficult spring, and by the summer of 1883, they were considering giving up the claim. Myrtle spent a long evening talking with Edwin about what might be done, and what they arrived at was an offer to buy the Garfield claim at a fair price, keeping the family in place as working tenants for a period of 2 years while they rebuilt their savings and decided whether to stay or move on. It was a solution that required Edwin's capital and Myrtle's conviction that people's circumstances mattered as much as their debts, and it worked. By the following spring, the Garfields were on stable footing, and they chose to stay. "You have a strong sense of justice," Edwin said to her one evening after the Garfield arrangement was settled. "My father raised me with one," she said. "He was not a man who had much, but he was a man who believed in fair dealing, and I grew up watching what happened when people with more power used it against people with less. I saw the way Clearwater's resources were distributed, the way the big operators waited for the small ones to fail and then bought them out at crisis prices. I came out here partly to resist that pattern." "I was part of that pattern," he said. "You were," she said. "And then you changed. Because of you. Because of what you were already becoming," she said. "I may have accelerated the timeline." He took her hand in the way he did, the comfortable, easy hold that was as natural to them now as breathing. "You accelerated a great many things," he said. Their first child was born in the summer of 1884, a boy they named Thomas Edwin, Thomas for her father and Edwin because it was his father's name as well, and the continuity felt right. Thomas was born in the new house in July with the assistance of the woman who served as midwife for the valley, and the birth was difficult enough to frighten Edwin thoroughly and leave Myrtle with a deep respect for the midwife's calm competence and her own body's resilience. Edwin spent the 12 hours of labor in the kitchen directly below, and Myrtle could hear him moving, the creak of the floorboards under pacing feet, the occasional sound of him adding wood to the fire even though it was July, and the fire did not need adding to. When the midwife brought him up to hold his son for the first time, Myrtle watched his face and saw something in it that was past any expression she had catalogued from him before, something vast and unguarded and grateful. "He has your nose," Edwin said. "He has his grandfather's nose," Myrtle said. "The Abbott nose is apparently dominant." "It's a good nose," Edwin said diplomatically, which made her laugh despite her exhaustion. Thomas grew well, a sturdy and interested child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's tendency toward stillness when observing something he found compelling, which was mostly everything. By the time he was walking and talking in his approximate fashion, the Abbott Kendrick operation had expanded to include the wheat variety, which was now formally in production, and a partnership with 2 other claim holders in the valley to collectively market their grain in Denver, an arrangement Myrtle had designed and Edwin had financed. Clara Jessup, who had become something of an unofficial grandmother to Thomas, and who came to dinner at the Abbott Kendrick house at least once a week, told anyone who asked that Myrtle Abbott Kendrick was the most formidably organized person she had ever met, and that the valley was better for having her in it. Silas Pryor came to supper on Sundays, a tradition that had started during Myrtle's first winter and had never stopped, and he and Edwin had developed the kind of friendship that happens between men of different generations when there is genuine mutual respect, the older man giving the younger access to 60 years of practical knowledge, and the younger man giving the older a sense of his experience still being useful and valued. Silas was 73 now and slower, and Myrtle had taken to sending Edwin to check on him after heavy weather, which Edwin did without being asked twice. The wheat trial results from 1883 and 1884 attracted attention from the Denver Agricultural Experiment Station, and a researcher named Holloway came to the Abbott Kendrick property in the fall of 1884 to see the operation and talk with Myrtle about the methodology. He arrived expecting, she sensed, a woman who had stumbled onto good results, and he left with extensive notes and a recommendation that she be included in the station's correspondence circle, which was as close to an official acknowledgement of expertise as the institution offered to women in 1884. Edwin had been present for the conversation with Holloway, not managing it but available, and afterward when Holloway was gone he said, "You handled that extraordinarily well." "He came in expecting to explain things to me," she said. "I let him explain for about 10 minutes and then I started explaining things back, and by the end of it he was taking notes. That's the only approach that works in those situations. I've never watched someone do that so skillfully," he said. "I've been doing it my whole life," she said. "Most women have." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew from his expression that he was thinking seriously about this rather than accepting it as a fixed condition of the world. "I imagine I have made that more difficult for women than I should have," he said. "Probably," she said, "but you're learning." "What I learned from you," he said, "is the most valuable education I've had." She looked at him across the kitchen table with Thomas sitting between them eating supper with the single-minded concentration of a 2-year-old confronting a bowl of corn mush. And she felt the fullness of what her life had become, not the life she had planned for in Cincinnati, not the simple, self-sufficient independence she had set out to create, but something larger and more complicated and more real. A partnership between two people who had started as adversaries and who had built something together that neither of them could have built alone. "Edwin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you came to make that first offer." He smiled at her across the table. "I'm glad you turned it down." The years that followed built on each other the way good things do, each one creating the conditions for the next. The winter of 1885 was hard, and the summer that followed was drier than usual, testing the drought-resistant wheat variety under precisely the conditions it had been designed for. And it held up, which expanded the operation and gave Myrtle's research real weight in the conversations being had at the Denver Experiment Station about regional agricultural adaptation. The easement corridor had become a feature of the property that felt natural, the cattle moving through it in their seasonal patterns, with a reliability that benefited both operations and that had become, in Myrtle's mind, a symbol of what the whole negotiation had taught her, that the thing you actually need and the thing you initially reach for are often different, and that the wisdom is in understanding the difference. Their second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Rose Clara after the woman who had welcomed Myrtle to Clearwater with both hands extended, and who cried when she heard the name in a way that required 3 successive use of her apron before she could speak. Rose was a different creature from Thomas, louder and more immediately present, with her father's gray eyes set in her mother's face, and she arrived into the world with the air of someone who had opinions about it and intended to express them. Silas Pryor met Rose when she was 6 weeks old and held her on his front porch in the June sunshine, and said that she had a look about her that suggested the valley had best be ready. And Edwin, standing beside him, said that the valley had already been getting ready ever since her mother arrived, and was perhaps somewhat more prepared than it had been. Silas Pryor passed away in the winter of 1887, quietly and at home, at the age of 76. He had been unwell for several weeks, and Myrtle had been visiting daily, bringing food and sitting with him in the evenings while the fire burned down, and he had talked during those evenings with the freedom of a man who had set down everything he was carrying. He talked about his wife who had died before he came west, about his children back east who had their own lives, and who he was at peace with not seeing more of. He talked about the land and what it had given him, which he measured not in harvests but in the quality of mornings, the specific mornings when the light came in from the east and hit the stone walls of the valley in a particular way that he said was worth everything it had cost to be there to see it. He left his claim to Myrtle and Edwin because he had no one else, and because he trusted them to do right by it, which they did. They eventually worked it into their operation, keeping the kitchen garden going and the chickens, because it seemed wrong not to. And the garden produced better than Myrtle's own in the years that followed, which she attributed to 70-odd years of careful tending, making the soil particularly receptive. Thomas started school in Clearwater in 1888, walking the 3 miles to town with a determined stride that made Myrtle's chest ache in a way she did not fully examine until she was alone on the road home, and then she examined it and identified it as pride complicated by the speed of time, and she allowed herself to feel it fully for a few minutes, and then went back to the work of the morning. By 1889, the operation had become substantial enough that Edwin hired a permanent foreman for the ranch, a steady man named Morrison, who had been working the eastern pastures for 3 years, and who Edwin trusted as he trusted few people. This freed Edwin to spend more time on the collective endeavors, the grain marketing, the ongoing discussions with the Denver experiment station, the management of the Silas Pryor claim. It also freed him to be present in the way Myrtle had early identified as important and which he had been working toward since he understood what it meant. He was present at supper every evening. He was present at the decisions and at the arguments, which they still had regularly, about everything from agricultural policy to the best approach to a particular fence section to whether Dickens was a sentimentalist, which remained a genuinely contested question between them. He was present at Rose's illnesses and Thomas's milestones, and at the quiet evenings on the east porch when the children were in bed and the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky and they sat together in the Colorado night and did not need to say anything particular. "Do you ever miss Cincinnati?" he asked her one of those evenings. She thought about it honestly. "I miss things from it," she said. "Certain people, certain comforts, but missing a place and wishing you were there are different things." "Would you go back?" he said. "No," she said, without needing to think about it. "This is mine. I came out here to claim something, and I did. It just turned out to be more than I was expecting." "What were you expecting?" "The land," she said, "and my own sufficiency. I was expecting to be sufficient unto myself, which I had decided was the highest ambition a woman in my position could realistically hold. And instead I found out that sufficient unto myself and connected to someone else are not mutually exclusive," she said. "That took me a while to understand. My father's absence taught me early that love meant being left, and I spent a lot of years deciding that the solution was not to need anyone. It took considerable effort to dismantle that conclusion." He put his arm around her on the porch bench, which was a gesture that was entirely familiar by now and that she had never once taken for granted. "I had a version of the same conclusion," he said. "Mine was that the safest thing was the thing you could own and control and that people were too uncertain to rely on. And," she said, "and I was catastrophically wrong," he said, "in the best possible way." She laughed at that and leaned into the warmth of him in the Colorado night, and the stars were extraordinary, and the mountains were solid in the dark, and the land that had brought them together stretched away in every direction, full and breathing and real. The spring of 1890 brought both celebration and change. The Colorado Territory was admitted to the Union as a state in August of 1876, and by 1890 the state was filling in, more people arriving, more claims being filed, more towns establishing themselves across the plains and valleys. Clearwater was growing. A second general store had opened, and then a doctor's practice. A proper school building replaced the church hall for weekly classes, and the Clearwater Grand Hotel added 4 rooms and, finally, a water pump that served the whole building. The arrival of more people and more development brought complications alongside the growth. Disputes about water rights as the demand on rivers and springs increased, arguments about grazing boundaries, the kinds of pressures that came when a landscape that had been sparsely occupied began to fill. Myrtle found herself drawn into several of these disputes not as a party, but as something between a mediator and a legal resource, because she had by now accumulated substantial knowledge of land and water law, and she had a reputation in the valley for fairness and clear thinking. Edwin observed her doing this work with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was revising his understanding of something upward, and one evening he said, "You should be a lawyer." "Women weren't admitted to the bar in Colorado until last year," she said, "and even now it's more theoretical than practical." "It'll change," he said. "It will," she agreed. "But in the meantime, I'm doing what I can do now, which is what I've always done." What she did in the summer of 1890, specifically, was mediate a water rights dispute between 3 families in the north part of the valley, who had been escalating towards something that Clara Jessup described as likely to get unpleasant, and the resolution she arrived at was based on a proportional sharing formula derived from the actual output measurements of the shared creek, measured over 3 years of records she had pulled together from her own work, and from the families involved. And it was a solution that was fair because it was based on data rather than assertion, and all 3 families accepted it because Myrtle Abbott Kendrick was the one presenting it, and everyone in that valley knew by then that she did not present things she was not certain of. Clara Jessup, who had been present at the final meeting because she was present at most things in Clearwater, said afterward to Edwin, "Your wife is going to solve half the problems in this valley before she's 40. She's solving the other half at home," Edwin said. Thomas was 6 and Rose was 4, and they were becoming themselves with the speed and determination of children in a rich environment, and watching them do it was one of the primary pleasures of Myrtle's life. Thomas was thoughtful and steady, and showed an early interest in the agricultural work that made Myrtle secretly triumphant, because it meant her father's legacy was going to continue beyond her own generation. Rose was electric and verbal, and already demonstrated the kind of persistence in an argument that her mother recognized from the inside, and that made Edwin shake his head with a combination of exasperation and pride. "She gets it from you," he said, when Rose had argued them both into a corner about something at supper. "She gets it from both of us," Myrtle said. "You are not yourself a person who gives up an argument." "I give up arguments," he said. "You give up arguments you've already calculated you can't win," she said. "That's different, that's strategy." He pointed his fork at her. "You're doing it again." "Yes," she agreed. They had a 3rd child in the spring of 1892, another boy they named Samuel, called Sam from the first day, who arrived with red hair that neither parent could account for, and that Clara Jessup found delightful, and that Edwin initially regarded with confusion, and then with complete acceptance, because Sam was himself from the beginning, a separate and specific person, and Edwin had learned from Thomas and Rose that children were not reflections but revelations. Sam's red hair eventually became one of the defining features of what the Clearwater community called, with warm familiarity, the Kendrick children, and then simply the Abbott children by those who had known Myrtle's history and understood the weight of that name. She had kept Abbott in her professional name alongside Kendrick, as a practical matter of reputation, but also as a matter of principle. The Abbott claim had been filed by Thomas Abbott and worked by Myrtle Abbott, and its contributions to the agricultural knowledge of the valley bore that name, and she intended to keep it there. Her father's letter, the one he had written when he left the land to her, lived in a small wooden box on her desk in the room she used as an office, the room that had once been the parlor, and that she had converted because she needed a desk more than she needed a formal sitting space. She read it occasionally, not out of grief by this point but out of gratitude, because the letter had set her in motion and the motion had brought her here, to this house on this land with these people, and the chain of causation was direct and clear, and she honored it. She went to her father's grave when she needed to think through something large. He was buried on the property, on the eastern slope with the view of the mountains, and she had planted a small wild rose at the head of the grave that had become substantial over the years, blooming every June in an extravagant way that Sela's prior had told her was a sign of good soil, and that she privately thought was something else entirely. She went there in the autumn of 1892 when Sam was 6 months old, and the wheat harvest had been exceptional, and the grain partnership had just signed a new contract with a Denver wholesaler that represented a genuine milestone, and she stood at the grave and told her father about all of it, which was something she did regularly and without embarrassment, because speaking aloud to someone you loved who was no longer present was not irrational. It was a form of continuing the relationship in the only way still available. She told him about the wheat and the water rights mediation, and about Sam's red hair, which made her laugh remembering. She told him about Edwin, which she had told him before but found she wanted to keep telling because her assessment of Edwin continued to evolve and she thought her father deserved to hear the updates. "You warned me about him," she said. "You were right to warn me. He was the version you warned me about for a while, but he changed. I think meeting the right resistance changes people, and I was apparently the right resistance for Edwin Kendrick. He's a good man, Papa. He works hard and he's fair, and he loves the children in a way that is genuine and constant, and he loves me in a way that I did not expect to have, and that I'm very grateful for. I think if you'd met him as he is now, you would have liked him. I think you would have shaken his hand and given him a hard look, and then eventually liked him." She stood in the October sunshine with the mountains vivid around her and the rose canes moving in the light wind and the sounds of the working property behind her, the distant voice of Thomas at some task, the sound of General Grant's successor, a younger mule named Sherman, expressing his opinions about something or other, and she felt the fullness of what had been built here. Edwin found her there, as he sometimes did. He came quietly and stood beside her and looked at the grave with the respectful attention he had always given to her relationship with her father's memory, and she put her hand through his arm and leaned into him slightly, and they stood together in the autumn light. "Good conversation," he said after a while. "Very good," she said. "He says you're acceptable." "High praise," Edwin said. "From Thomas Abbott," she said. "It genuinely is." Clara Jessup's health began to decline in the winter of 1893, slowly at first and then more rapidly in the spring, and Myrtle spent the months of her decline doing what Clara had done for Thomas Abbott in his last years, visiting with food and conversation and practical help, sitting with her in the evenings, and listening to the stories of a life that had been long and vivid and largely self-made. Clara had come to Colorado as a young widow in 1868 and had built the laundry and the life and the community of warmth around her through 25 years of effort and generosity. She passed in June of 1893, in the same month as the roses, and Myrtle felt it as a specific kind of loss, the loss of the first person who had welcomed her to this place, and who had therefore been present at the beginning of everything that had happened here. She planted a rose at Clara's grave too, and visited it with the same regularity. By 1895, the Abbott-Kendrick operation was one of the most admired in the Colorado Valley, not because it was the largest, but because it was managed with a combination of scientific rigor and human decency that was unusual, and that produced results other operators noticed. The drought-resistant wheat had been formally adopted by 3 other farms in the valley, under licensing arrangements that Myrtle had structured carefully, and that produced modest income alongside the primary satisfaction of seeing the work extend outward. Thomas was 11 and showed his mother's gift for systematic thinking and his father's gift for reading a landscape, and he spent his free hours on the property with a purposefulness that suggested he had already decided what his life would be, which was here on this land. Rose was 9 and had discovered books with the fervor of someone who has found their element, and the household's reading material had been substantially expanded to meet her appetite. Sam was 3 and red-haired and joyfully chaotic, and Edwin chased him through the house and the yard with a patient endurance that Myrtle found consistently beautiful to observe. She sat on the east porch in the October evening of 1895, 13 years after she had arrived in Clearwater with 3 trunks and $47, and a deed to land she had never seen, and she looked at the mountains and thought about all of it, the full span of it, the way a life accumulates itself from decisions and chance, and the particular grace of finding the right resistance at the right moment. Edwin came out and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and the simple ease of a man in his rightful place, and handed her 1 cup, and she took it, and they sat in the familiar, comfortable silence that was one of the most valuable things she had. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Everything," she said, "starting from the day you rode up to my fence." "What about it?" "I was terrified," she said. "I've been told you were dangerous and relentless, and you were sitting on that horse looking like you expected to get whatever you came for, and I was standing there with a rifle thinking that I had to hold this ground no matter what it cost me." "You did hold it," he said. "We both did," she said, "in different ways." He was quiet for a moment. "I came that day with an offer I thought was fair, and a certainty that you'd take it. I rode home with a counteroffer I hadn't expected, an agreement I hadn't planned for, and the uncomfortable beginning of a feeling that was going to be considerably inconvenient." "The feeling was inconvenient," she said. "For about a month," he said, "and then it became the most important thing in my life, and it has remained so." She looked at him in the October evening, gray eyes that she could now read completely, the open warmth of them in the fading light, the man who had become essential to her in ways she had never expected to allow. "Edwin," she said. "Myrtle," he said. "I'm glad you came with less patience than you thought you had," she said. "If you'd been patient enough to wait another year, I'd have been more entrenched and considerably harder to approach." "You were already considerably hard to approach," he said. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed, and the warmth in it was complete. They sat together in the October evening, while the mountains went from gold to purple to the deep blue of night, and the stars came out over the Colorado high country in their particular extravagance, and the sounds of the property settled into the quiet murmur of everything in its right place, the distant movement of cattle on the evening air, the sound of the children's voices, as Edwin's ranch foreman Morrison's wife read them a story inside, the low, steady voice of the house and the land. Reliable and present. Myrtle put her head on Edwin's shoulder and felt the steady warmth of him, the particular gravity of a person who has become home, and she thought about her father's letter, the apology and the instructions, the name underlined twice, and she thought that her father had been right to warn her and right to leave her the land, and that the land had given her everything she had needed and more than she had known to ask for. The counteroffer had been the right move. She had known it when she made it, had calculated it carefully in the weeks before Edwin rode up with his offer and his gray eyes and his certainty. She had given him less than he came for, and she had taken more than she had planned to, and the balance of it, worked out over years of shared mornings and argued evenings and children and harvests and grief and joy, was the most precise and satisfying equation she had ever solved. The mountains stood in the dark, as they had always stood. The spring ran clear at the north edge of the property, as it had always run. The land that Thomas Abbott had claimed and Myrtle Abbott had kept and Edwin Kendrick had eventually, in the most important sense, joined rather than conquered, breathed in the October night with the slow, sure breath of something rooted and real. And on the east porch of the house they had built together, Edwin Kendrick put his arm around Myrtle Abbott Kendrick and said nothing because nothing needed saying, and she felt it, the whole of it, everything from the beginning to this moment, and forward into all the mornings that were still coming, the extraordinary plain fact of a life fully and honestly inhabited. The stars were very clear over Colorado that night. General Grant's successor, Sherman, made one final and deeply considered complaint from the paddock, and then fell silent. The October wind moved through the wild roses that grew along the east fence, the ones that had started from a cutting of her father's grave planting, the ones that bloomed every June in colors that made Thomas and Rose and red-haired Sam stop in the yard and look, the way children stop for things that are simply too beautiful to pass without acknowledgement. The light in the kitchen window held, warm and steady, against the dark. Everything that had been in conflict had found its resolution. Everything that had been hidden had come into the open. The forced choices had been unmade by better ones. The dark past had been examined and set down. The betrayal had been answered with a counteroffer that turned out to be the opening offer of something worth far more. Myrtle Abbott had come to the Colorado territory with a deed and a determination, and a name underlined in a letter, and she had made of all three something that would last beyond her, in the land and the wheat and the water records and the children who carried her stubbornness and his steadiness, and the particular combination of both that was entirely their own. She closed her eyes in the October night and listened to Edwin's steady breathing and the sound of the land, and she was, completely and without reservation, at home.